They said the desert kept its secrets. But that morning, the wind was whispering one name over and over again. Lila. The town of Mercy Hollow woke to smoke. Gray ribbons of it rose from the far end of Main Street, where the gallows leaned like a weary skeleton against the morning light. The boards creaked as the wind scraped against them, a sound that mixed with the soft, steady crying of a single woman kneeling in the dirt. Her wrists were bound in front of her. A frayed rope cut red grooves into her skin. Her hair, once the color of chestnut, was matted with dust and blood. The townsfolk stood back, too close to watch, too far to help. They didn't speak her name aloud anymore. To them she was the witch, the whore, the betrayer. Only one man stood apart from the crowd, his hat shadowing his face, the preacher, Reverend Cole Harker. He held a revolver at his side, the silver cross at his neck glinting in the pale light. He was there to deliver the sentence. The charge was betrayal. A trader's son had vanished after visiting her cabin 3 nights past. When his horse came back riderless, folks said Lila May had cursed him, that her hymns weren't prayers, but spells, that she'd sold his soul to the sand. Nobody spoke of how she'd been the only one to tend the boy's fever last winter. Nobody mentioned how the town's women had come to her door with bruises they couldn't explain. Mercy Hollow liked its stories neat and its women quiet. But Lila had never been quiet. When the preacher stepped forward, the crowd parted. The air felt brittle, like it might shatter. He looked at her, really looked, at the rope burns, the trembling lip, the eyes too tired to weep anymore. "Any last words?" he asked, his voice gravel wrapped in scripture. Lila lifted her chin. Her voice came out cracked but clear. "Just one, Reverend. Look inside the hymnal." The murmurs rippled through the crowd like water around a stone. Harker frowned. He didn't know what she meant until he saw it. A worn leather book lay half buried near the gallows post, pages fluttering like wings in the wind. His hand hesitated before he picked it up. Inside, written in small shaking script between 2 hymns, were the words, "He wasn't lost. He was saved. Check the well behind the chapel." For a long moment, the only sound was the rasp of the wind. Then, somewhere beyond the gallows, a child's voice broke the silence. "Papa!" the boy called from the back of the crowd. "She's telling the truth." Every head turned. And in the thin gap between those who believed and those who wanted to, a seed of doubt took root. The preacher's fingers tightened around the gun. His thumb brushed the hammer. But his eyes stayed on the hymnal, on that shaky scrawl, the tremble of someone trying to write while running out of time. Then he looked back at her. Her mouth was bloodied, but her gaze didn't waver. In that silence, something cracked open inside him, something older than law, older than faith. He lowered his gun. The sheriff shouted. The crowd surged. Someone spat, someone prayed, someone sobbed. And in the dust between them, the preacher dropped the gun into the dirt. "Unbind her," he said. No one moved. "Unbind her," he repeated, this time louder, his voice a command that rang across the town square like a sermon. The rope came loose, leaving angry welts on her wrists. She didn't flinch. She just stared at the man who'd been sent to damn her, and had instead read her last prayer. The preacher turned the hymnal over in his hands and tucked it into his coat. Whatever happened next, the story of Mercy Hollow had already changed. The sun was just breaking over the mesa when the preacher stepped behind the chapel, hymnal in hand. The air there smelled of iron and old wood, and the well stood like a wound. Stone ringed, half collapsed, the rope frayed where the bucket once hung. He looked down. Darkness swallowed the bottom hole. Behind him, boots scuffed. Sheriff McCrae's voice rasped, cold and certain. "You gonna dig up ghosts now, Reverend?" Harker didn't answer. He just dropped a small stone and listened. No splash, just a dull, hollow thud. "Some things are better left buried," the sheriff went on. "The town needs peace." The preacher turned, face calm but eyes burning. "Peace built on lies don't hold long, Sheriff." By noon, half the town had gathered again, not out of faith, but curiosity. Men with hats pulled low, women clutching rosaries, a boy holding his mother's hand too tight. Lila stood apart, wrists raw, but unchained now. Her eyes followed every move as the preacher tied a new rope to the old winch and began lowering himself into the well. Dust and sunlight spiraled above him, like scripture turning to ash. The walls were damp, the air thick with the rot of time. When his boots hit bottom, he lit a match. The light flickered over stone, and then over something else, a boot, a pale hand, and beside it, a small wooden cross carved with initials, TM. The preacher's chest tightened. The boy hadn't been cursed. He'd fallen, or been pushed. He found another mark on the stones, half buried in mud, the sheriff's pocket knife, initials JM on the handle. When he climbed back up, the crowd saw it before he spoke, the knife gleaming in his fist like a verdict. He didn't need to say much, just 3 words. "He didn't drown." Silence hit like thunder. The sheriff's jaw worked, chewing air. "You don't know what you're saying." Lila stepped forward, voice steady. "He came to my door that night, said your boy was drunk, bragging about the bounty. You told him to scare me, but he fell." "Didn't he?" The preacher turned to the crowd. "She wrote the truth in her hymnal, and you burned her house for it." A murmur rose, shame, disbelief, anger, all tangled together. Someone whispered, "Lord, forgive us." Another spat in the dirt and walked away. The sheriff's hand twitched toward his gun, but the preacher's hand was already there, firm, calm, unwavering. "You pull that iron," Harker said quietly, "and you'll damn what little's left of you." The sheriff froze. For the first time, his eyes dropped. Behind them, a small sound broke the standoff, the low whine of a dog padding from behind the chapel. It carried something in its mouth, a child's shoe. McCrae's face drained of color. He fell to his knees. By evening, they'd pulled the boy's body from the well, wrapped it in linen, buried it behind the church, with the others lost to dust and guilt. No trial, no shouting, just the sound of shovels and breath and wind. Lila stood beside the grave, her hands trembling around a single dandelion she'd found in the dirt. The preacher watched her press it into the soil. When she turned to him, her voice barely carried. "You gonna stay preacher after this?" He thought a long time before answering. "I reckon I'll still talk to God," he said. "But maybe now I'll listen to people too." As the last light slipped behind the hills, Mercy Hollow fell silent. But something had shifted in that silence, a crack of truth, a small, defiant mercy. The hymnal lay on the chapel steps, open to a page marked with dust and tears. And between the lines of "Nearer, my God, to thee," someone had written in faint pencil, "Truth don't save the soul, but it keeps it honest." The preacher didn't sleep that night. The fire in the chapel stove burned low, shadows crawling up the walls like smoke from an old sin. The hymnal lay open beside him on the table, its pages smudged with the fingerprints of two people who'd been through the same fire, one who wrote and one who read. Outside, the desert wind carried the smell of rain that would never fall. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the town dogs answered, a broken choir of mercy and warning. Lila hadn't spoken since the burial. When Harker finally found her, she was sitting beside the ruins of her cabin, the moonlight catching on something dark against her shoulder blade, a scar, deep and cruel, shaped like the letter B. "Branding iron," she said softly when she saw him looking. Her tone was flat. "Sheriff said it'd remind folks what I am. B for betrayer." He looked at the wound, skin puckered, raised, raw at the edges. No tears, no shame, just survival. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked. "Well, would they have listened?" She said, eyes fixed on the horizon. "A woman saying the law's hand burned her? That don't earn sympathy here, Reverend. That earns another brand." She stirred the ashes of what used to be her porch. Among the gray, a glint caught the light. The branding iron itself, half buried in cinders. "Guess the fire didn't eat it all," she murmured. The preacher crouched beside her. The metal was still recognizable. Twisted handle, curved letter, blackened from heat and sin. He reached out, but she stopped him with a hand on his wrist. "No, Reverend," she said. "You don't get to carry this one for me." They sat there, neither speaking for a long time. Then, in the quiet, a sound drifted up from the town, low voices, torches being lit. Men gathering again. Guilt, when cornered, always comes back mean. "They're coming," she said. "You should go." "I'm not leaving you." She looked at him then, the faintest trace of something human in her eyes. Disbelief, or maybe sorrow. "You can't save what ain't yours to save." "Maybe not," he said, "but I can stand beside it." When the torches reached the ridge, Harker stepped forward into the light. The sheriff wasn't among them. They'd locked him up for now. But the men who followed him before were, faces half hidden, carrying the same fear that built gallows and called it justice. "She bewitched the Reverend now," one shouted. "Look at him, turned against his own." Another added, "We can't let her stay. She'll bring ruin." The preacher's voice was calm, but sharp enough to cut the wind. "Ruin's already here. You built it." He pulled something from his coat, the iron brand, cold and rusted. "This what you're afraid of? This mark? Then fear yourselves, not her." He dropped the brand into the dirt. Then, before anyone could speak, he struck a match and tossed it down. The dry grass caught. Flames rose, licking the twisted metal until it glowed red one last time, then crumbled, falling to ash. A hush fell. No gun was raised, no word spoken, just the faint, defiant hiss of something evil burning itself out. Lila stepped forward, face lit by firelight. She stared into the embers, then knelt and pressed her palm against the cooling ash. When she lifted it, a black smear stained her skin. A mark, yes, but one she'd chosen. "Guess I'll wear this one," she said. "It's mine now." Somewhere in the back of the crowd a small sound rose, not shouting this time, but clapping, Just one pair of hands, a child's. Then another joined. Then silence again. The preacher watched their faces change. Confusion, guilt, something softer. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a beginning. Later, when the crowd had gone, the preacher and Lila stood over the ashes. He spoke first. "You'll leave at dawn?" "I'll head north," she said. "Maybe find a town that don't believe in ghosts." He nodded. "If you find one, send word. I've got a few sermons that need burying." She smiled, a rare, tired, unsteady thing. "Maybe I'll send you a hymnal instead." The fire burned itself down to coals. The night air turned cold. The preacher turned the old brand over with his boot, what was left of it anyway, then picked up a fragment and tucked it into his coat pocket. Not as proof, as memory, because some marks aren't meant to fade. They're meant to remind. The dawn came cold and colorless, the kind that makes the land look older than it is. Mercy Hollow lay quiet under a thin shroud of dust. No smoke from chimneys, no church bell, just the echo of what had burned and what was left unsaid. Lila walked out from the edge of town with a canvas satchel and a torn coat. Her boots sank into the gray dirt like the town itself was trying to hold her back. She didn't look behind her. The preacher stood at the crossroads, hat low, hands buried in his coat. He didn't try to stop her. That was never his right. But when she passed, he said only, "There's water 10 miles north. Ride the ridge, not the river. The coyotes run the flats this time of year." She nodded, not slowing. "Reverend," she said, her voice rough, "you keep preaching to them?" "Maybe," he said, "or maybe I'll just listen till they remember what mercy sounds like." A faint smile ghosted across her lips. "Then maybe we'll both make it." By midday, she was a dark speck against the bright horizon. The preacher stayed until she vanished, then turned back toward the chapel. The door creaked open, like it remembered too much. Inside, pews sat broken, dust motes floating in sunbeams like lost souls. He knelt at the altar, not to pray, but to think. His revolver lay beside the hymnal, both useless tools, in a place that no longer needed either. On the front page of the book, written in Lila's delicate scrawl, were words he hadn't seen before. Maybe she'd written them during the night. Some prayers don't rise. They stay in the dust, waiting for someone to kneel beside them. He closed the book gently, as if it were alive. Outside, a crowd had gathered again. Not angry this time, just lost. Old men with cracked hands, women who'd seen too much, children who'd learned to whisper instead of speak. They looked to him, not for salvation, but for something simpler, direction. He took a long breath. "You all came to hear what happens next," he said, "so listen close." His voice carried steady, low as thunder across open plains. What happened here ain't witchcraft, ain't miracles, just people forgetting what a lie costs. Every lie you let stand builds another gallows. Every silence tightens another rope. He paused. The wind lifted dust around his boots. "Start talking again, to each other, to the ones you buried, to the ones you burned." No one clapped, but no one left either. That night, the preacher dug a hole behind the chapel. He placed the broken brand inside, the iron now black and harmless, and covered it with soil until it vanished beneath his hands. Then he pressed a small stone into the mound. No cross, no name, Just a single word scratched into the rock with his knife. Truth. He sat there till the moon rose high, pale and indifferent, lighting the shape of that word until it looked almost holy. Far to the north, Lila followed the ridge the way he'd told her. The wind stung her cheeks, and the sky stretched so wide it made her feel both small and endless. Her scar itched beneath her shirt, the brand that wasn't a wound anymore, just a map of where she'd been. When she reached a dry riverbed, she stopped and built a small fire. The flame flickered weak, blue, stubborn. She took the last page of an old hymnal, the one she'd carried since the gallows, and fed it to the flame. The ashes rose like black feathers, floating into the dark. She whispered, not as a prayer, but as a promise. Not gone, just carried. Back here in Mercy Hollow, the preacher heard coyotes crying somewhere far beyond the hills. He thought of her, walking beneath that same moon, and for the first time in years, his heart felt something close to peace. Not the kind preached, but the kind lived. He opened the hymnal again, thumb tracing the worn edge where her writing began. Then he picked up his gun, unloaded it, and placed both objects side by side on the altar. One made to end life, one made to remember it. He blew out the lantern, letting the night fill the chapel like a baptism. Weeks bled into months. The rains never came. But the town began to sound different, softer, like an old wound finally scabbing over. The gallows had been torn down. The square now stood empty, except for a patch of scrub grass and the stone the preacher had placed behind the chapel. Children played near it, not because they understood, but because they weren't afraid anymore. The preacher watched them sometimes from the porch, coffee cooling in his hands. He'd stopped wearing his collar. The cross still hung around his neck, but it wasn't a badge now, just a memory. One afternoon, a small boy came running up the hill, a coil of rope dragging behind him like a snake. "Reverend," he called, "found this down by the creek." The preacher froze. The rope was the same kind used for hanging. He took it slowly, feeling the rough hemp between his fingers, the same texture that once dug into Lila's wrists. "Where'd you find it, son?" "By the old well," the boy said. "It was caught in a thorn bush." That night, the preacher couldn't sleep again. He carried the rope out behind the chapel and laid it beside the stone-marked truth. The moon was high, pale as a scar. He stared at the rope for a long time, his jaw tightening. Then he struck a match and dropped it. The flames caught fast. The smell was sharp, almost sweet, like sin burning clean. He didn't move until the last ember died, leaving only a black thread of smoke curling into the stars. Behind him, small footsteps rustled. He turned to see the same boy watching from the shadows. "You shouldn't be out here, Caleb," Harker said. The boy stepped closer. His face was solemn, too old for his years. "Ma says you burned the rope, 'cause you're mad at God." The preacher smiled faintly, tired. "No, son. I burned it 'cause I'm trying to make peace with him." The boy looked down at the ashes, then up again. "Can I help?" They gathered stones together, piling them over the ashes until a small mound stood beside the one for the brand. When they finished, the boy asked, "What do we call this one?" Harker thought for a moment, then handed him his knife. "You name it." The boy knelt, tongue caught between his teeth, and carved slow letters into the stone. When he stepped back, the preacher read the word in the moonlight. Voice. For a long time, they just stood there, listening to the desert breathe. By the next morning, word had spread. The children of Mercy Hollow, wild little ghosts with dust in their hair, had started bringing things to that place. A doll with a missing arm, a tin cross, a faded ribbon, offerings maybe, or forgiveness in smaller hands. The adults pretended not to notice, but they did, and something in them began to ease. A widow stopped by with a loaf of bread and left it on the preacher's steps. A rancher, who'd once spat at Lila's name, brought nails and wood to mend the chapel door. Even the wind felt gentler somehow. Brushing through the town like it, too, was trying to start over. The preacher didn't speak much about what happened, not in sermons, not in confession. But on Sundays, when the bell rang again for the first time, his words were plain. Mercy ain't about forgetting what was done. It's about remembering who we still can be. And in the back pew, where light slanted through a broken pane of glass, sat the children, barefoot, wide-eyed, whispering to each other in that secret way kids do when they think they're guarding the world. Outside, the graves by the chapel grew wild flowers, where there'd once been nothing but dust. Chatter far off, beyond the ridge, the preacher sometimes thought he saw a rider, small against the horizon, dust kicking up behind her horse. He never tried to follow. He just lifted his hat and let the image fade into the heat. Because some ghosts don't haunt. They guide. And in Mercy Hollow, the wind no longer whispered Lila. It whispered truth, voice, and mercy, the three words that saved the town more than any sermon ever could. Years drifted by like tumbleweeds across the empty flats. The town changed, slow and stubborn, the way the desert does, not by storms, but by quiet persistence. Mercy Hollow wasn't a place of fear anymore. It wasn't holy either, just human. The gallows square had turned to dust and daisies. The chapel leaned a little more each year, but the bell still rang every Sunday, soft, imperfect, enough. And behind it, where the two stones stood, truth and voice, a small patch of green had taken root. Wild at first, then tended. Someone had fenced it with old timber. Someone watered it when rain failed. Nobody ever said who. The preacher grew gray, then thin, then slow. His sermons shortened with the years, until they were less about God and more about the small mercies of daily living. Bread shared, wrongs righted, quiet forgiven. Most days he sat by the chapel door, mending books. The hymnal, Lila's hymnal, always rested near his hand. Its cover was cracked, its pages loose, but it was still whole, the way he'd become. Broken, but kept together by purpose. One evening in near spring, as the sun sank over the mesas, he noticed a figure walking down the northern ridge. The gait was steady, the horse old. The wind carried the faint creak of saddle leather and the jingle of a small charm. He rose, slow but sure, dusting off his coat. The rider stopped just short of the chapel steps. Lila dismounted. Her hair had silvered. Her eyes hadn't. She smiled faintly when she saw him, that same tired, patient smile he'd seen once under the noose. "Still preachin'?" she asked. "Mostly listening now," he said. "Town's quieter." She glanced past him toward the garden behind the chapel, where yellow blooms leaned in the dusk. "Heard tell you planted something out here." He shook his head. Not me. They did. She walked to the stones, kneeling between them. Her fingers brushed the soil, now rich with roots. Truth and voice, she murmured, and they lived. They sat together until the stars came out, two souls who'd burned through their shame and come out the other side, not clean, but still standing. Lila took something from her coat pocket, a folded scrap of paper, soft and thin from years of travel. She handed it to him. He opened it carefully. Inside, written in her same, small, stubborn handwriting, was a single verse. Mercy don't fall from the sky. It grows where someone dares to plant it. He looked up, eyes damp but not from grief. You kept it all this time. Carried me farther than a horse ever did, she said. He laughed, quiet, rough, real. Guess that makes us both drifters now. When morning came, she was gone again. No farewell, no trail. Just the faint scent of smoke and wild sage on the breeze. But near the garden, something new had been left between the two stones. A single scarlet seedling, freshly planted. Its leaves glistened in the dawn light, defiant and green. The preacher knelt beside it, touched the soil around its roots. He didn't speak, didn't pray. He just stayed there until the light turned gold, until the wind picked up and carried the smell of that living thing across the empty plain. Years later, after he was gone, travelers passing through Mercy Hollow would stop at that little patch of earth behind the chapel. The stones still stood, truth and voice, and between them a small tree had grown. No one knew its name. No one knew who planted it. But the locals said if you pressed your ear to the bark, you could hear something, like wind through an old hymnal, like a woman's whisper carried on dust. They called it the Tree of Mercy. And when the sun set behind it, the light caught the words carved faintly into the trunk, weathered but still legible. She was spared once, and because of that, we all were. If you ever find yourself riding through Mercy Hollow, stop by that chapel, touch the stones, look at the tree. Then ask yourself, what would you have done that morning in the square when the rope was drawn and the crowd waited for a lie to feel like justice? Because that's what the desert remembers. Not who sinned, but who stayed and who lowered the gun. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe my channel.